Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon, depending where you are. So, we'd like to welcome you to this again discussion um, that is going to talk about leveraging regional trade in a changing global order. Uh, without further ado, we would like to start off, but first, let me tell you a few things. One, we have simultaneous interpretation going on in French. If you are English speaker, um, if you are English speaker, uh, uh, um, or French speaker, you will be able to go down, and then you will be able to see where there is an interpretation service being provided. That's one. Second, this discussion is going to be interactive. So I'd like to, if you wish to speak, please, you will raise your hand, and then we'll be able to promote you to the panelists to allow you to talk. Then you will be able to switch on you can unmute yourself and also put up your video. So my name is Didier Habimana. I'm the communications officer for ECA in Eastern Africa. It's my pleasure really to welcome you to this discussion. Without further ado, let me ask Andrew Mould to have the welcoming remarks, and then I will start off the discussion. So Andrew, over to you.
Good morning, dear participants, Didier colleagues. Welcome to this third and final event in this year's annual meetings. This series of meetings is called, it's quite a long name, Intergovernmental Committee of Senior Officials and Experts Group Meeting, which is our annual meeting, which we hold each year. And we started on Wednesday with a joint session with our colleagues from Central Africa, which was generally about the macroeconomic and social situation in the region. And we discussed one thematic paper related to productive capacities in the region. Yesterday, we had a very interesting session on the overseas development assistance and cutbacks and how that was impacting on the region. And today's session is about trade and trade performance. And being a trade economist myself, it's the session which is closest to my heart. And we're very privileged today to have distinguished representation from ministries of trade across the region, and also a number of well-recognized trade experts to intervene on the panel. So we're very happy to have everybody there. We'd like to keep this meeting as conversational as possible. So we could ask perhaps if people's interventions could be short and to the point, and then enable people to come back several times and speak openly about the different topics. So we're going to be actually starting with a presentation, work that's been undertaken in the trade cluster here, led by my colleague Rogers Maguire, and with Simon Asaquete, and supported by some of the other colleagues in the cluster, Elena, John and Rosemary. So we'd like to take you through some overview, basically, of trade performance in the region, and then open the floor, basically, to what we hope is a lively discussion on this very important topic. So any more announcements to make, Didier, at this point? I think some people have joined us. You may just wish to explain again the instructions about the translation and the chat and the raising of questions.
Yes, just again to highlight that this is a webinar, so the style of a webinar is quite different from any normal Zoom exchange. So for the webinar, we have panelists that are promoted to talk. So if you are definitely want to speak, so you can raise your hand. So by clicking on a button below where it says raise your hand, and then we will promote you to be able to speak. So that's one. Second, should you want also to ask your questions, to make a comment, so there are two ways to do that. So you can either use the chat room of the discussion. That's where we'll be posting also a number of documents as we are discussing. So you can use the chat already. People have started, exchanging on the chat, or you can go where there is a question mark below with Q&A letters. So when you click there, also you'll be able to submit either your question or you make a comment. But again, like Andrew said, so we want this discussion to be conversational and interactive as much as we can. So we will encourage the members of the private sector, the government officials, and also other partners to raise their hands and contribute after this presentation that is going to be shared among our colleagues. So you are welcome, and it's a pleasure to have you. So let's start off with the first presentation. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you very much, Didier. We will kick off with just basically giving an overview of the trade situation in the region. As all the participants are aware, there's been a tremendous amount of discussion about global trade ever since back in April, the US administration announced really unprecedented levels of tariffs on imports into the United States market. And that's caused a lot of uncertainty and I think concern in our sub-region about how Eastern Africa may be affected. We want to give you some tentative answers to that question based on the data that we currently have available. But this is where we'd really like to, ask you for your views and receive your input as well about how our regional colleagues are faring in terms of trade. So let me start with a general overview of the global economy, and then I'll pass the floor to my colleague Rogers, who will take you through some more specifics. So I think the first thing to stress is the announcement of tariffs by the US created a lot of concern about the direction of the global economy. And we can see clearly from this first graphic that actually growth has been slowing down very significantly since the rebound from the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, 2021, particularly in the high-income economies, where the current forecast for the IMF for 2025 is just 1.4%. But we notice that this is quite a broad phenomena, that we also see that the forecast for the global economy, for the developing and emerging markets is also very much downwards. So there's concern that the global economy is basically stalling. Now, one of the reasons this is happening is because of this uncertainty generated by current policies. And we can see this in the next slide. This comes from a recent World Bank presentation on the state of the global economy, looking particularly at trends for the developing countries. So one indicator of global concerns is weakening commodity prices. So since the beginning of this year, commodity prices have been seen to turn down quite sharply. Energy prices in particular, so for fuel and oil exporters, this is a negative, of course, but for many of the countries in our region, as net fuel importers, that's a positive. But we also see it to a degree in minerals and metals. Now, we're going to come back to you with a much more nuanced story on this, because this is not true of all mineral exports, and nor is it of all commodities. So we need to nuance that observation. But the general trend is towards declining global commodity prices. We also see it reflected in terms of the developing countries, which, please go back. We also see it reflected in terms of manufacturing orders by countries which are most engaged in trade amongst the developing world. So quite a sharp downturn in manufacturing export orders. And it's reflected also in bond spreads, which have been very volatile, as well as stock market indexes in the developing world. So there's general concern about the direction the global economy is going. Now, the big factor here to consider is, of course, the tariffs. And these were initially announced in April, but there was subsequent revision to the tariffs that the US was going to impose on the 1st of August. And this was basically here, this graphic shows you the tariffs which are currently going to be applied from the 1st of August. So it's quite early now. We're just into October, and you can see that some of the US's trading partners are going to be hit very hard by these tariffs. Most notably, India and Brazil at 50%. The US's near neighbor Canada 35%, China 30%. The European Union has done a deal with the US, but it's on average around 15% tariff. Now, with regard to the African continent, there were initially some announcements of very high tariffs for Lesotho, for example, Madagascar. Those have subsequently been revised. And for Eastern Africa, we can appreciate that there are 3 countries that are hit by a 15% tariff: Uganda, DRC, and Madagascar. But for the other countries in Eastern Africa, they're going to face a 10% tariff. Now, as we are going to go on and see, this will have some implications, because it actually does mean that other trading partners with the US are being hit by higher tariffs than the African continent. So we'll come back on this point when we see the regional performance. So I think the first thing to stress here is these tariffs seem to be shifting the global geography of trade quite dramatically. So the first graph here shows you the trend in global exports. And perhaps a bit surprisingly, in the first quarter, we actually saw quite strong growth of exports. But this is partially explained by efforts of exporters to ship to the US before any tariff measures were imposed by the Trump administration. And so we can see in the next chart that imports to the US actually surged in the first quarter in an effort to avoid paying these tariffs. This matters, of course, for the global economy because the US is such a large importer on a global scale. It's responsible for around 13% of all imports in the world. So it does have ripple-on effects. And as you can appreciate in the next graph, you can see that China's exports to the US actually went up in the first quarter. And this phenomena even started back in the final quarter of 2024, when it was known that President Trump had won the elections in anticipation of a new set of tariffs. So there was a degree of front loading in terms of trying to stock up in the US. For example, big companies such as Walmart increased their inventories enormously, just try to minimize the impact of these tariffs. Now, with regard to African trade performance, we see that actually last year, global exports from the continent were starting to soften. Export performance was not particularly strong outside the continent last year. And this year, there was a slight uptick. But generally speaking, the aggregate trade performance of the continent has not been that strong. So now we'd like to go into the detail, and I would now like to pass the floor to my colleague, Rogers Maguire, who will take you through this key question of how dependent is the region on the US market. So Rogers, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, distinguished delegates and colleagues. My name is Rogers Maguire, Economic Affairs Officer. And as Andrew has pointed out, I will discuss the importance of the US market to the region. So as you've heard, given the volatility in the markets that has been induced by the US tariffs, it is important to analyze how dependent the East African market is on the US market. So how dependent is our region on the US market? Firstly, it is crucial to take stock of AGOA's record for African countries, because AGOA was designed to boost African exports to the US. However, as we can see from the data, if you look at the chart, AGOA has delivered only modest gains. So exports of AGOA peaked in the early 2000s, principally driven by rising commodity prices. And from then on, it's been a steady decline. So in 2024, you can see that African exports to the US, the share of African exports to the US has stagnated at about 5% of total African exports. So basically, this underscores AGOA's limited long-term impact for the region. Now, the chart to the right shows Eastern Africa's exports in 2024, and it's grouped by country and continent. So basically, what it shows is that in 2024, China was by far the largest destination for East African exports. It accounted for 32% of exports. This basically reflects a growing trend of deepening ties with Asia. Now, Africa itself is the second largest market for Eastern Africa, with 26%. This underscores the growing importance of intra-African trade. And then Europe, previously, which was a major trading partner for the region, has declined to 12%, which shows you that there's been a major reorientation of trade from Eastern Africa, with Asia now being our biggest market. But importantly, relating to this discussion, we can see that the United States takes only 3% of East African exports, which confirms that the region is not heavily dependent on the US market. And actually, this will be important as we think about the post-AGOA landscape. Next slide, please. Now, just to highlight what I was pointing out in the previous discussion, if you look at which countries have benefited from exports to the US, for our region, it's only been a handful of countries, and mainly exporters of textiles. So these are Kenya, Ethiopia, Madagascar, and Tanzania. So basically for our region, these are the only countries that have been dependent on the US markets. And even for these countries, Kenya, Ethiopia, Madagascar, their share of total exports, if you compare their share of total exports to the US vis-a-vis the global market, you can still see the US is still a very small share of their markets. So like I said, for our region, the US market is not that important, except for a few sectors, which was the textile sector. Now, turning to the next slide. In the next slide, what we're going to discuss is what analysts have been expecting, what trade analysts have been expecting. And in this first slide, what I'm showing you is a recent analysis that was done by our sister organization, the International Trade Center, which is Geneva-based. And it suggests that AGOA-eligible countries in Africa will see a decline in collective total for the continent of 8.7% by 2029. Now, their forecast also points out a larger impact on exports such as the textiles and the South Africa and cars. So basically, for the textiles, it's going to be the AGOA, the countries in Africa that have been benefiting from AGOA. And then for the vehicles, it's mainly Southern Africa which will be affected. Now turning to the chart on my right, which shows us the changes in exports to the US. What has happened to changes in exports to the US? So this analysis is based on the most recent US data So while the first chart was showing you expectations from a model, this chart on my right is actually showing you what the actual data is pointing out for African countries. So what has happened to exports from our region to the US for the period April to July, when the first US tariffs were put in place, compared to a similar period last year. So basically, what has happened is that unexpectedly, exports from our region to the US have actually increased. If you look at the DRC, for example, exports from the DRC to the US in April, July 2024 were about $118 million. In April, same period in 2025, exports from the DRC to the US increased to $1 billion, approximately $1 billion, an increase of about 860%. So you can see there's been a major increase in exports from DRC to the US. Now, this has been principally driven by exports of minerals to the US. Now, looking at other countries in the region, and I will focus on the countries that have majorly benefited from AGOA. So if you look at Uganda, Ethiopia, and Kenya, for all these countries, exports to the US have grown, and it's been a major increase. For Uganda, it was 120%, Ethiopia 95%, Kenya 22%. So this is not what we expected. This is different from what the analysts had assumed. Now, and importantly, if you look at what has happened to total African exports to the United States between the period January, July, the first 6 months of 2025, you can see that they've increased by 22%, approximately 22%. Now, the performance of African exports to the US is in contrast to what is happening to the Chinese exports to the US. If you look at Chinese exports in the same time period, they're down by 36%. So this is a result of the tariffs that have been imposed. So what is happening is a major reorientation of global trade. So while exports from Asian countries that were hit with much higher tariffs have been declining to the US, what we see is that exports from African countries which were hit by relatively lower tariffs are actually increasing. So this is different. This is not what the models initially expected. So basically, just go back to previous lesson. So actually, there's a possible scenario where Eastern Africa comes out actually benefiting from the tariffs. It's still early days, but Eastern Africa could actually benefit from the tariffs because exports from our region have become relatively cheaper than the exports of our global competitors. Next slide, please. So now let us look at the issue of African imports from China. So the question is, what is happening to to Chinese exports now that China is facing increased tariffs from the US? So on the left, the bar chart shows the percentage change in Chinese goods exports to selected countries between June and August 2025 compared to the same period a year earlier. You notice that the exports to Nigeria surged by nearly 60%. Other African and Asian countries such as Egypt, Vietnam, and Thailand also saw significant increases. Now, by contrast, exports from China to the United States fell sharply, reflecting the impact of the new tariffs and trade tensions. This indicates that as China loses ground in the US market, it is increasingly redirecting its exports to Africa and other emerging economies. And this is an issue of concern for our policymakers. Now, the picture on the right is from an article that appeared in African Business. And And what it shows basically is the concern that the surge in Africa's China imports is going to lead to higher trade deficits. So Chinese goods into Africa have surged in 2025. They've raised concerns about the widening trade deficits. And analysts are already warning that while China exports massively to Africa, African exports to China remain limited, and they're basically commodity exports. So this is not good news for structural transformation in Africa, is because it ties us into the same the original relationship that we've had with all these other global countries where we export commodities. And I think it's important to point out that what we're getting from China is mainly manufactured goods, and what we're exporting to China is commodities. So it has a very inverse effect on our structural transformation in Africa. It's basically not good news. So at this juncture, let me invite my colleague Simone, who will discuss East Africa's trade performance. Her presentation will be in French, so please turn on your translations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rogers. Can you hear me?
We can hear you very well, Simone.
Yes.
Parfaitement.
Thank you. Thank you. Bonjour, chers participants, distingués invités. Je m'appelle Simone Assakwete, je suis économiste à la Commission économique des Nations Unies pour l'Afrique, le Bureau sous-régional pour l'Afrique de l'Est. Alors, à la suite de Andrew et de Rogers, nous allons nous poser la question sur les leçons que nous pouvons tirer des performances commerciales des pays d'Afrique de l'Est. Quelles sont les leçons ou bien que nous enseignent ces performances commerciales? Alors, le premier constat qu'il faut faire, c'est que les pays d'Afrique de l'Est sont preneurs de prix sur le marché international. Cela veut dire que ces pays peuvent bénéficier des flambées de prix des matières premières, mais sont tout aussi exposés aux effets négatifs de leur baisse. Alors, on va commencer notre présentation en essayant de voir les différentes tendances de prix des principales matières d'exportation dans les pays d'Afrique de l'Est. Et le premier constat qu'il faut relever, c'est que depuis 2024, on observe une certaine volatilité des prix mondiaux pour les matières premières. Mais cette volatilité est en train de s'amenuiser et en raison des incertitudes liées au commerce mondial. Notamment, on peut citer les prix du pétrole brut qui ont connu une tendance à la baisse en raison d'une faible demande mondiale. De même, ceux des produits alimentaires qui sont également de plus en plus modérés. L'autre point important qu'il faut relever, c'est que certains prix des matières se démarquent de cette dynamique. On peut observer l'envolée des prix de l'or en couleur jaune sur le tableau à gauche. Vous voyez que depuis 2014, l'envolée a commencé pour les produits aurifères. Et aussi, dans le tableau de droite, on peut considérer les prix du café qui observent une envolée également très significative au cours de ces derniers mois. De ces 18 derniers mois. Cette flambée des prix constitue un coup de pouce majeur pour les pays exportateurs d'or d'Afrique de l'Est, notamment l'Ouganda et la Tanzanie, qui ont tous dépassé les 3 milliards de dollars américains en matière d'exportation d'or l'année dernière. Également des pays comme l'Éthiopie, le Rwanda et l'Érythrée y ont tiré un grand profit. Pour les exportations de café, et lorsqu'on parle de café ici, il s'agit essentiellement du café arabica, l'Ouganda a obtenu des résultats remarquables et il est prévu que les exportations de café de l'Ouganda dépassent les 2 milliards de dollars. L'Éthiopie, en tant que berceau du café également, a largement bénéficié de cette flambée de prix du café. Next, please. Voilà, passons maintenant à la performance même. La performance commerciale globale des pays d'Afrique de l'Est en observant leur balance commerciale depuis 2024. En 2024, on peut observer sur le graphique que la plupart des économies ont observé des exportations notables. Les exportations ont augmenté assez rapidement et plus rapidement d'ailleurs que les importations. Des pays, par exemple, comme l'Éthiopie, le Rwanda sont en tête de file et enregistrent chacun des croissances des exportations d'environ 30%. principalement portée par une forte demande des prix élevés pour l'or et également pour le café. Mais ce qu'il faut aussi relever, c'est que tous les pays d'Afrique de l'Est n'ont pas connu les mêmes résultats. Prenons les pays comme Madagascar, par exemple, qui ont été durement touchés par la chute de la demande mondiale et aussi la modération des prix que nous avons vu dans notre slide précédent. Et les produits les plus touchés sont essentiellement leurs principaux produits d'exportation, que sont la vanille, le clou de girofle et le nickel, entraînant pour Madagascar des contractions d'exportation. Aussi, pour Djibouti, on a noté une relative faible performance commerciale. Et cela peut être expliqué par les perturbations dans la mer Rouge en 2024, aussi leur point de vue. Pour le Burundi, quant à lui, le problème de sous-facturation des exportations agricoles, en particulier pour le café et le thé, a faussé les chiffres officiels d'exportation. La croissance des exportations pour ce pays, pour le Burundi, c'est quelque peu modéré, en partie en raison de la baisse des prix du pétrole et aussi peut-être la privatisation de leur principale entreprise d'exportation du café. Alors, ce qu'il faut également dire, hein, c'est que la région a tellement bénéficié pour ce qui est des importations de la baisse du prix du pétrole. La région est essentiellement importatrice du carburant et ainsi que la baisse des produits des denrées alimentaires sur le marché international, ce qui a tellement favorisé la région. Yeah. Next, please. Voilà. Le slide présent renforce le message selon lequel la performance des exportations en Afrique de l'Est a été plus forte que prévu. Nous avons les chiffres du Fonds monétaire international, ses prévisions pour 2025, et il est aussi prévu qu'on atteigne aussi des taux de croissance assez élevés. Sur le tableau qui vous est projeté à l'instant, on voit que les données préliminaires pour les 5 premiers mois de 2025 plusieurs pays enregistrent des croissances remarquables par rapport à la période de 2024. L'Éthiopie, par exemple, arrive en tête avec une augmentation de 68% d'exportation, suivie de l'Ouganda avec 50%. Les autres pays également affichent une croissance à 2 chiffres et on peut clairement l'observer sur le tableau. Maintenant, le tableau à droite examine la balance commerciale des pays d'Afrique de l'Est en pourcentage du PIB en 2024. En 2024, pour 7 pays qui ont amélioré leur balance commerciale par rapport à 2023. Le secteur des exportations de l'Afrique de l'Est fait preuve d'une résilience et d'une solidité dans de nombreux pays qui se traduit par des balances commerciales assez saines, comme vous pouvez l'observer sur le tableau. Et c'est ce qu'il fallait démontrer vraiment sur cette partie. Et ce qu'on peut dire en résumé, c'est que la flambée de ces prix des matières premières d'exportation, essentiellement l'or et le café, a considérablement amélioré les performances commerciales de nombreux pays d'Afrique de l'Est. Cela, à coup sûr, peut leur permettre de renforcer leurs réserves d'échange et poursuivre leurs objectifs de développement. Mais en tant que preneur de prix, comme on l'a dit au début, sur le marché international, cette seule dynamique risque de comporter des risques, par exemple. Cela peut nuire à leur résilience face aux chocs extérieurs dans un environnement mondial quasi incertain, comme nous l'observons de nos jours et comme l'a présenté mon collègue Andrew et Rogers. Donc, il est essentiel pour ces pays de tirer parti de ces conjonctures internationales favorables à court terme, mais de garder quand même en ligne de mire les objectifs fondamentaux de transformation structurelle de leurs économies. Oui, à ce point, je vous remercie et je pense que je vais passer la parole à Andrew pour la suite de la présentation. Merci pour votre attention.
Okay, so I have some good news to finalize this presentation and some bad news as well. So let's start with the bad news. Jean Bosco, I see you have a question or query. Perhaps you could just come in after finishing the presentation. So as a consequence of this rather selective increase in certain commodities and very moderate, declines in others, we see something which is probably not desirable for the long-term growth and development of the region. So if we look at the figures for from 2009 for the share of minerals in total East African exports, we see that at around 20% of the total. But by 2024, it's over 53%. So there has been a marked increase in dependence on minerals. Now, there is a school of thought that because a lot of people are talking about the importance of critical minerals now and this commercial warfare between the United States and China over these matters, the region could leverage this in future for its own benefit. But I think the general story that we have to tell here is of some concern about the increase in dependence on primary commodities on the one hand, and the decline of manufacturing as a share of total exports, which is very clear in the next graph. So things are not going in the direction that the region would really like to be seen in terms of economic diversification and value added. So that's the bad news. As for the good news, while Africa's trade to the rest of the world has been quite shaky, we can appreciate that the intra-regional component has been much better. So in 2023, Africa's exports to the world declined by about 8% to outside the continent, but there was a modest growth in 2023, showing the resilience of the intra-African component in a global context where global trade declined by 4%. In 2024, we saw this phenomena again, but much more pronounced. So we see a really quite strong growth in exports within the African continent, 8.5%, whereas Africa's exports to the rest of the world, the growth was negligible. So it seems clear that one of the most dynamic parts of regional trade performance is clearly the intra-African component. And we can verify that looking at the figures for the East Africa Community. So East Africa Community has enlarged its membership in recent years, as you know. We here keep the figures to the original 6 members, just to avoid distorting the numbers with the inclusion of the Democratic Republic of Congo, because of course, as such a large commodity exporter, it does change the absolute figures for inter-regional trade. So if we look at the original 6 members, we see a very strong dynamic element in terms of inter-regional trade. And last year, from 2023 to 2024, we saw actually an increase of more than 20% in the total intra-regional trade component. So it surpassed for the first time $11 billion US. And that's equivalent to nearly 4% of regional GDP. Now, this matters because, of course, whereas we're talking about a trend where there's this heightened dependence on mineral exports to the rest of the world, the more diversified component of regional trade is clearly the intra-regional part. Okay, so all of our countries, where they export diversified goods, it tends to be to the regional market, not to the international market. So this is a good positive trend going forward in terms of if our countries want to turn around the situation of a growing dependence on mineral exports, then the way to do that is to go the regional route. So some conclusions or summaries or observations, at least, on which we can use as a basis for the subsequent conversation. To summarize, we see that Eastern Africa's performance is actually being quite resilient in 2024. And what we see on the basis of the preliminary data is that carries into 2025, with DRC, Ethiopia, Kenya gaining from trade diversion, despite the US tariffs and geopolitical tensions. So we've seen trade go up to the US in this period, although as we stressed earlier, it's quite early to tell. So these are preliminary results at the moment. And let's bear in mind the context. The US market is not one of the prime markets for the region. Commodity exports have been strong. And this is an a priori observation when the tariffs were initially announced. It was quite clear, I think, to some people that Africa's mineral exports would not necessarily be impacted. The US was still going to need raw materials. And so we've stressed the thing about the only diversified sector where there have been advantages of exporting to the US under AGOA has been in the textiles and clothing sector for our sub-region. And there we see that tariffs have disproportionately impacted on other countries. So the trade opportunities and risks, regional integration and commodity-driven exports are boosting performance, but tariffs and global uncertainty expose the limits of reliance on certain external markets. A third point here is rising interregional trade is promising in terms of value addition, and in particular at a time of the AFCFTA implementation. So it gives a good ground, I think, for achieving greater regional integration. Fourthly, we've just stressed the structural vulnerabilities. So the heavy reliance on commodities, particularly gold, but also other commodities, and the decline in manufacturing share exposes the region to external shocks. Most countries continue to face quite large deficits, also saw modest improvement in some countries in 2024. And the final point, and I think this is really the issue for discussion in this session, is about infrastructure, the need for infrastructure upgrades, the need to tackle the very persistent non-tariff barriers, greater trade facilitation, and reforms to offer pathways to greater export diversification and industrial development. So with that, I think we'd very much like to hear from everybody. I'll just say a word or two about a couple of these publications that the office has undertaken. The report on the left here, earlier this year, we launched a report on improving food security in Eastern Africa, stressing the potential of intra-regional trade of helping food security. And we undertake quite a lot of analysis of the trade flows in the region and just show how dynamic that component of intra-regional trade is as well. And our colleagues in Addis Ababa have released this very important report this year with the African Union and the African Development Bank, the ARIA report, Assessing Regional Integration in Africa, which focuses very much on this issue of moving from the AFCFTA towards a African continental common market and a customs union. So that's a very important topic as well. So please, you're welcome to look at that research. So with those comments, we'd very much like to hear from you about some of the trends we've explained here, your observations about the general global trading environment, and how the region can really leverage these changes and protect itself from the negative impacts of the instability that's currently going on. So thank you. Didier, would you like to kick off the discussion first, please?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Rogers. Of course, despite global trade disruptions, so Eastern Africa is showing strong export performance. Yes, let's open the discussions. Like I said, let me repeat it again. Should you want to intervene, you can raise your hand and then we'll promote you. But I'm not sure whether we have Madam Priscilla Andrianarivo, who is the Secretary General of the Ministry of Industrialization and Trade in Madagascar. Do you want first to start the conversation? And please, you have 5 minutes to make your interventions. Then you will be followed by Madame Rosine Wamale, who is the country director of Trademark. And then we will also hear from Kaifas Chekoti, who is the head of the Trade Policy Training Center in Africa. So let's start with Priscilla Andrianarivo. Madame, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup de m'avoir donné la parole. Donc, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, chers collègues, bonjour à tous. Je suis Geneviève Priscilla, secrétaire générale au sein du ministère de l'Industrialisation et du Commerce à Madagascar. Tout d'abord, je souhaite exprimer au nom du gouvernement malagasy notre gratitude à la Commission économique des Nations Unies pour l'Afrique pour son invitation et pour l'organisation de cet échange de haut niveau. Cette réunion se tient à un moment crucial, marqué par des profondes mutations de la politique commerciale mondiale qui nous obligent à réfléchir ensemble sur des réponses coordonnées, résilientes et solidaires. Depuis de 20 ans, les relations commerciales entre Madagascar et les États-Unis reposent sur l'AGOA. Donc, les États-Unis représentent près de 40% de nos exportations manufacturières et le secteur textile habillement est le plus concerné. Il pèse à lui seul plus de 80% de nos exportations vers ce marché et génère plus de 80 000 emplois directs. Pour Madagascar, l'AGOA n'est donc pas un simple mécanisme préférentiel. Il est un levier industriel, social et économique majeur dont dépendent des milliers de familles. Depuis le 1er octobre 2025, avec l'expiration de l'AGOA dans un contexte de blocage budgétaire aux États-Unis, nos exportations sont désormais soumises aux droits de douane normaux, ce qui réduit immédiatement la compétitivité de nos produits textiles face à d'autres fournisseurs mondiaux. À cela s'ajoute une taxe additionnelle initialement de 47%, ramenée à 15% grâce à un plaidoyer actif du gouvernement malgache, mais qui reste un fardeau important pour nos exportateurs. Face à ce choc, Madagascar a pris des mesures immédiates. Toutes les procédures nationales liées aux exportations AGOA continuent d'être assurées afin d'éviter toute rupture dans les activités des opérateurs. L'État, le secteur privé et les partenaires techniques se mobilisent de manière conjointe pour défendre nos intérêts. Nous restons également vigilants car la possibilité d'une reconduction rétroactive de l'AGOA demeure ouverte une fois la crise budgétaire américaine surmontée. À court terme, donc, nous intensifions nos plaidoyers diplomatiques et techniques pour obtenir un allègement tarifaire supplémentaire et une extension temporaire du dispositif. Nous travaillons également en coordination avec d'autres pays africains concernés afin de défendre collectivement un meilleur accès au marché américain. À moyen et long terme, Madagascar mise sur la diversification de ses partenaires commerciaux et sur l'intégration régionale. La ratification de la ZLECAf en avril 2025, la présidence actuelle de la SADC et notre engagement actif au sein du COMESA et de la Commission de l'océan Indien ouvrent des perspectives prometteuses pour développer des chaînes de valeur africaines, attirer des investissements et renforcer notre résilience face aux chocs extérieurs. La suspicion de l'AGOA est une épreuve, mais aussi un signal. Elle nous rappelle la nécessité de repenser notre modèle, de défendre nos acquis et d'accélérer notre intégration continentale. Oui, nous continuerons à plaider auprès de nos partenaires américains, mais nous miserons également sur la ZLECAf, la SADC et le COMESA pour bâtir une économie plus diversifiée, compétitive et résiliente. Madagascar est convaincu que grâce à l'unité africaine, la solidarité régionale et à une vision tournée vers l'avenir, nous pourrons transformer cette contrainte en opportunité de développement durable. Je vous remercie de votre attention et je m'excuse de ne pas avoir pu présenter un PowerPoint pour cette présentation. Donc, je reste disponible avec ma collègue pour les échanges après. Je vous remercie encore.
Madame Priscilla, peut-être on peut vous poser des questions, en fait, sur ces questions de l'impact sur le Madagascar malgache sur ce tarif. Parce que ce n'est pas la première fois que Madagascar a eu ce problème avec accès au marché américain, n'est-ce pas? Il y avait un problème, je pense, l'année 2008-2009, une suspension de l'AGOA dans cette époque. Je voulais poser des questions si cette fois, on pense que la situation va pire que la dernière fois.
Je vous remercie pour cette question. Comme j'ai dit tout à l'heure, je suis ici avec tous mes collègues, donc j'ouvre la discussion avec tous mes collègues si je vous permettez bien. Merci encore.
D'accord, d'accord. On va revenir sur ces points. OK. Didier.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. Rosine, do you want to come in, and if you have a comment or a clarity that you probably need from the presenters, so you have the floor. You can open the mic and put up a video as well. Or shall we first go to if Rosine, you are not available?
I am available, Didier.
Okay.
I'm just requesting not to put my camera off, but for the benefit of other participants, just to say hello. And thank you very much, Andrew and your team, for a very good presentation. It really comes at the right time. I think for me, I have some reflections.
Rosine, would you like to just introduce yourself? I don't know if all the colleagues know.
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Let me just put the video on. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Rosine. I'm the country director of Trademark Africa here in Rwanda and former commissioner of customs. I insist on that one because we're talking about the non-tariff barriers. So if I insist on the non-tariff barriers, you will understand where I'm coming from. So Andrew, if you allow, I can just put off my camera and share some of the reflections and the comments I had on Rogers and Simone presentation.
Please, yeah.
So I think the findings reflect the real challenges that we really see in West Africa, especially rising global pressures and continued dependence on a narrow export base. But on the other hand, I personally like the report. It gives a different perspective. From the presentation, you can see with all this pressure, but there are some opportunities. But again, there are also this can also expose the region to the risks. From here, I think it is a call for action for us to be proactive and be intentional on the measures that we should take. I've seen in the presentation that for China, right after the US imposed the sanctions, they started increasing their export to Africa. To us, it's yes, good news or bad news because it may not be very favorable to our industrialization policy. But again, we can see where we can learn from, especially on importing raw materials. So let me highlight 3 quick reflections on the study. First of all, I like the idea on the diversification. So we rely too much on raw commodities, which leaves us vulnerable, as Andrew said. The US-China tariff war shows how quickly demand for Africa export can fall. When you look at what is happening, yes, for the EAC, it has increased, but again, this is temporary. We should be watching and see how this will look like in a few months. So to build the resilience, we need stronger regional value chains in agribusinesses, in textiles, and also automotive sector, as this is a priority for the CFTA. But again, we also need to increase intra-trade Africa. From the numbers, I think so far it looks good, but we really need to make sure that this trend continues. On top of that, we also need to look at how we can tap into trade in services because just relying on commodities may not be favorable to Africa. So we should also be looking at different areas such as logistics, ICT, tourism, which can also drive competitiveness. So for us at TMA, we are really supporting this by strengthening logistics, ICT, and tourism services as an enabler for value addition. Linked to this, is the question of non-tariff barriers. I liked how the report really presented this issue. The non-tariff barriers remain a major obstacle in the EAC, increasingly in the form of mainly standards and the regulations. Cases are rising faster than they are being resolved, with an average of 9 months to settle one. I think from the recent study and the report from the EAC, it's now taking almost 297 days in East Africa to get the non-tariff barriers resolved. And most of them are in food export that are especially affected, hunting farmers and food security, of course. And this highlights the urgency of harmonizing the standards and the strengthening NTB resolutions. Otherwise, the region will not really be able to benefit from the CFTA and to complicate the intra-trade policy that we have. So finally, we cannot ignore the importance of data and implementation. Without timely data, like the data we have just seen in the report, we cannot manage shocks or seize new opportunities. And the CFTA will only deliver of commitments if commitments are implemented and institutions can also adapt quickly to global changes. So, Andrew, those are some of the my reflections and contribution. Otherwise, thank you very much for the study. It shows where we are and it calls for action to make decisions and to make to put in place measures to be able to cope with this changing dynamics. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rosine. So Trademark East Africa has clearly a key role in trade facilitation in the region, and I think you raised a number of important points there. The services trade, you're quite right, and our background document here, just to try to capture what the current state of trade was in the region in this circumstance of global instability, didn't look at services trade at all. Now, services trade is actually the one part of global trade which is really quite buoyant at the moment. So the WTO, I believe, is forecasting growth of about 4% for services trade globally this year. And of course, it's unaffected by the US tariff policy. And you're quite right that it's a very important element, I think, for our sub-region. The challenge is, of course, the data on services trade actually is released with a much bigger time delay than the merchandise trade data. So if we wanted to talk about the current realities of what's going on in the sub-region, it's better to focus for the time being on merchandise, but the point is well taken about the importance of services. So I see there's a number of people that wish to speak. John Bosco's had his hand up for a while. We have from the Ethiopian Embassy, Kadir Fereja as well, who would like to speak. And from the floor, we also have Claire Soit. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Didier, is anybody else to add there?
Sure. But first, before John Bosco, can we first have Mr. Chikote Kaifas, who is the head of Trade Policy Training Center, because he expressed that he might not finish all the webinar. So let's Lily give him
yes, please,
the
Kaifas.
privilege.
Yes. Welcome, Kaifas.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you so much, Didier. Glad to join you. Sort of, we have a workshop going on, so I just had to step out. But very interesting insights from the report.
Kaifas, sorry, you may again wish to introduce yourself more fully, because
sure.
Not everybody's aware of TRAPCA. Those of us involved in
sure.
trade, we are, of course. You're based in Arusha there. Very important training center.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you so much. My name is Kaifas Chikote. I'm the head of the Trade Policy Training Center in Africa. Within ESAMI. ESAMI is intergovernmental, owned by 10 African countries. And we provide capacity building on trade-related areas, all trade-related areas for the continent. I think increasingly we're having a footprint with our alumni spread all over the continent, including with Andrew as one of the partners. But let me now just delve into the discussion. Maybe if you don't mind, I can take off my video.
Sure.
Basically, so what I was saying is that the report has captured very interesting insights, and I think highlighted important dimensions. The vulnerability with respect to dependence on minerals, that in itself is an issue, obviously. And for me, I think I want to zero more on the good news. The fact that intra-regional trade has gone up, and that intra-regional trade to a great extent is composed of value-added products. I think for me, that's where the opportunity is. And probably that's where we need to put more of our energies as ESC. And in my reflection, I'm just thinking maybe we need to rethink an export-oriented ESC strategy where we put emphasis on regional value chains and then craft free zones, whether it is export processing zones, industrial parks along these value chains that have the value chains integrated and also allow the SMEs to have nodes where they can plug into these zones. And in that way, support them with an elaborate innovation ecosystem where we bring the knowledge generators, whether they're tertiary institutions and the think tanks, to actually support and work with industry so that then they're generating solutions and products with a high knowledge intensity. And that is where probably the greatest input would be to drive value addition, especially with respect to our products. Like the report has highlighted, the value-added products are being traded within the region and within the continent, not yet outside Africa. Part of that is because then there are requisite dimensions, whether it is standards, the knowledge interest in the products, that would actually make these products be able to meet international standards and be able to be competitive outside. So to me, I think that is really key. And that, of course, needs to be supported with the very clear investment in the enablers. The report has brought that out clearly. And if you recall, Andrew, when we did that book chapter on textiles, I think the conclusion was capabilities. Investment in the development of capabilities within the industry. And I think that becomes so relevant here if we're thinking about value addition and actually enhancing and boosting regional value chains. And to me, that's now where the role of the government, where the role of the ESC governments becomes so central, because then the ministers of finance become really critical in mobilizing resources to then ensure that the investment in the enablers, whether it's infrastructure, whether it is the requisite skills, whether it is, and of course, infrastructure, you're looking at transport, you are looking at energy, you are looking at ICT infrastructure, you're also looking at standards infrastructure, the labs, for example, for testing and so forth. So for me, that is really critical. And maybe from an ESC perspective, that's maybe we need to push a narrative where the governments look at this as an opportunity from a regional perspective. I think probably part of the challenge, maybe it's my own view, part of the challenge has been that most of our ESC member states approach regional integration with a national lens. So in the process, the regional integration agenda has a lot of back and forth, without really tangible milestones being realized as documented in the ESC Common Market Protocol, for example. So I look at that as the way for diversification. Services, Rosin mentioned, very important. Here, I made a presentation yesterday and looking at Uganda, 75% of the services exports for Uganda is tourism. That's highly concentrated. And yet we have the rest of the services now with respect to technology, where they are looking at financial services, fintech, and so forth. But that requires a clear export-oriented strategy, but from a regional perspective. So for me, that is probably an area that maybe we need a little bit of more reflection. What would be the actionables to actually boost this? Because then it will reduce the dependence on the mineral exports, but it will also then mitigate the vulnerabilities and allow these economies to become more resilient. So that is briefly what I want to contribute. Thank you so
Excuse me, sorry, is there somebody with their mic open? Wasim? Oh, please, sorry. Sorry, Kaifas, you were just closing your remarks there.
Yes, I was saying, for me, I think this is probably an area that we need more reflection on to see what could be the tangible initiatives with actionables that actually the EAC as a region could pursue to get regional value chains actually started. Yeah, with the EAC governments really being instrumental, especially with respect to the enablers as a region, in terms of mobilizing resources to ensure that then the enablers are realized, because critical investment and resources are actually required to make that happen. So basically, that's what I wanted to share to complement the good work on the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kaifas. You touch on a lot of issues there. I'm not sure we're going to be able to come back on all of them, but I mean, I think this thing about coordination amongst East Africa community members in terms of the policies on these regional value chains is a very important insight. You also mentioned something about textiles and clothing. I wondered whether we could come to Claire Soy, who's a legal expert from the University of Cambridge based in Kenya, just to talk a little bit about that particular point on textiles and clothing. And then I see our colleague Jean-Luc, the director of our Central African office, wishes to come in, and also the gentleman, please, from the Ethiopian embassy as well, please.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you very much. I don't know whether you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you, Claire. Yes.
So thank you so much. So perhaps just to chime in into the discussion on textiles and clothing, perhaps just a few pointers, or what I've really noted as well, is obviously with Kenya was once threatened with, being exited from AGOA if they don't accept, for instance, secondhand clothing from America. In exchange for, market access to America. And obviously that raised a lot of legal issues pertaining to, for instance, dumping of secondhand clothing in Africa. So, I mean, as AGOA expires, and I think everybody's trying to figure out whether it's going to be renewed, or perhaps the US is exploring other options, as the Kenyan government had tried to do before in the Uhuru government, trying to explore a strategic partnership, a specific one, perhaps with the US. I think it's very important to have a keen look, perhaps, policy and legal interventions on this issue somehow. Because in as much as a lot of these countries export clothes to the US, it's a huge market. For instance, in Kenya, I think it employs around 60,000 people. And it was on TV the other day, a lot of people are at the risk of losing their jobs. It's also very important to acknowledge the fact that a lot of those clothes, they leave the African continent new, and then they come back as secondhand clothes. And they do have significant impact on the environment in this part of the world. So, for instance, we've seen a lot of documentaries from Ghana. There's a lot of documentaries on the impact of secondhand clothes on Ghana. And we can also see that in Kenya. The Kenyan textile industry, for instance, hasn't done so well in a very, very long time. And that has a direct correlation with the import of secondhand clothing into this country. And perhaps one of the ways in which I was thinking about it was perhaps to redefine what it means, what dumping actually means, because the reason why a lot of African countries haven't been able to legislate this, or perhaps to litigate this in the WTO or other forum, is because second-hand clothing does not meet the definition of what is dumping under the anti-dumping agreement. So a lot of people and a lot of legal scholars have tried to call upon the WTO and many other countries to perhaps change the meaning of dumping to include environmental damage, because of perhaps what we've seen in this country and in many other African countries on what second-hand clothing is actually doing to our environment. Yeah, so perhaps that is something that we can think about as we continue with the discussions.
Thank you very much for that insight. I wasn't actually aware that second-hand clothing could not be considered an item which was being dumped actually through WTO legislation. Though I suppose it is a moot point at the current juncture, how much global rules are going to be playing in terms of determining, global trade and regulating global trade when the leading global trader, the United States, is not actually abiding by WTO rules and regulations currently. So I guess that's a wider discussion we could have with all the participants here, isn't it? Yeah, thank you for raising that very interesting insight. The gentleman from the Ethiopian embassy that wished to intervene. Kadir? We talked very much about the strong export performance from Ethiopia, so it would be very interesting to hear from them. Are they still online?
Perhaps before he comes in, John Bosco has been really
Insistent. Oh,
he's been
Please.
insisting to speak. John Bosco, can you come in, please?
Yes, as a very valuable partner. Please, John Bosco,
Yes,
please introduce
thank
yourself.
You. Thank you very much, Andrew and the entire team, for the excellent presentation on trade performance across our region. Indeed, I want to really record my appreciation to UNECA. I do advisory activities, but the work you've been doing is really spot on and very robust. So I had a question to Simone. Generally, when she presented the trade balance as a share of GDP, I was expecting to see countries Rwanda and Uganda. These countries really doubled the export performance, but I wanted to look at their current account deficit. Where does those two countries stand? And I think it is prudent to also highlight that, especially the East African country, where do we stand in terms of our trade deficit, and given that our export is growing. I wanted also to echo or submit on the performance of intra-regional trade. The recent report authored by both UNECA, ADB, and African Union highlighted the performance of East Africa, where the intra-regional trade currently stands at around 28%. It has almost doubled. Intra-regional trade has doubled. On the back of the development of infrastructure, especially productive infrastructure, I think that is a strong point to note in terms of the region. An attempt to remove or eliminate non-tariff barriers across our corridor. The work that has been done by Trademark on one-stop border posts, which has ably reduced the time and cost to trade across borders. But having said that, I think the reason, the elephant in the room is the productivity enhancement. I was looking at the productivity growth index. ESC were not doing well. Even the report highlights that our productivity level is still very low. So I think when you look at the growth, any growth to be sustainable, inclusive, and resilient, you must really enhance your productive capacity, especially in the value chain where the region has both comparative and competitive advantage. And I remember the ESC, and when I was in the EABC, we had earmarked around 5 regional value chain including agro-processing. We looked also at transport and logistics, which is very critical. We looked at the automotive sector, pharmaceutical, leather and leather-related products, textile and apparels. So I wanted to see that while we speak about the performance of the region, but we need also to highlight the anchors. What are the fundamental anchors for the region? Where do we really stand? And perhaps not only on the two commodities, gold and coffee, but also look at the growth of other regional value chain. And I didn't see that within the report. Where can we put our efforts? Where can we put our level of diversification in terms of product diversification as well as market diversification? I think Claire highlighted about the issue of the AGOA extension, either to be extended or not. But you need to take into account that that is a unilateral agreement. It is upon the goodwill of US. Whether it is extended or what, any leader can decide to terminate it any time. So our resilience depends on our ability to diversify our markets and our ability to diversify other products, especially where we have both comparative and competitive advantage. Finally, I think we have also seen that there are a number of barriers coming in play. More NTBs are coming up. You saw what happened with Tanzania restricting MSMEs to play in their market. And I think also the report should not be so diplomatic. You must highlight those issues that I know Andrew tries to be a good diplomat, but I think I think with data, the data speaks more loud than a million words. So issues that are impeding our intra-regional trade, like the recent ban by Tanzania, and I'm going even to speak on CNBC, a recent ban of Tanzania MSMEs to play from Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, to play in their market, has a detrimental impact or a knock-on effect on the growth of intra-regional trade. So we need to flag that out. We need to flag those issues out. And I think my brother Kefas also spoke about standards and SPS measures. When you look at the recent report, standards and SPS measures are becoming a very, very heavy NTBs on the growth of intra-regional trade. So finally, I think we need to leverage our digital innovation. We need really to support around the rollout of digital infrastructure, digital networks, as also buffers for the external vulnerabilities. Thank you very much. Otherwise, I want to really thank everyone.
Thank you very much, Jean Bosco. There's plenty of food for thought in what you've said. And I would totally agree with you about your concerns about the productivity. And you asked one specific question about the trade deficits. So in the presentation, we just highlighted that half the countries have seen some improvement in their merchandise trade deficits. The other half, not much change. And this is despite strong export growth. The issue here, I think, Jean Bosco, to point out is, of course, the volumes of imports are considerably larger than the volumes of exports. And consequently, you need a much higher growth rate of exports than imports to make a notable change on the trade deficits. So we noted that there was some modest improvement in some countries due to this strong export performance we'd seen in a handful of 5 or 6 countries which had double-digit growth in the region in this past year. We're hopeful that that performance continues this year, and the preliminary data we showed from the IMF for the first 5 months of the year suggests that it will be the case, strong export performance. But the thing that we really stress is this lack of value addition. So we weren't able to give you a firm picture of what's happening with the regional value chains, precisely because the data is not broken down like that. But it is at least encouraging that where the most diversified exports go, which is to the regional market, there seems to be strong trade growth. And I'm pleased that you cited some EAC figures there, which kind of confirm that. Didier, where are we with interventions? Who else would like to intervene?
Yes, we have the director of ECA in Central Africa.
Yes, Jean-Luc, of course, please.
Jean-Luc Mastaki. Director, if you can I think we can see a backlight from the video you are sharing. I'm not sure whether you can change the position, but please, you have the floor.
Yes, my office is very
Yes, you're a
dark.
little bit dark, Jean-Luc, today.
Okay. If you can probably lower if you're using a laptop or a desktop, lower it so that you don't see the window behind.
Oh, Didier, I want to do that now.
C'est pas grave.
C'est pas grave. Allez-y.
Bienvenue, Jean-Luc.
Merci beaucoup. It has been really a pleasure following these good presentations by yourself, Andrew, and colleagues. And I think really we have missed an opportunity as Central Africa to be all of us part of this and learn from these major trends in trade and intra-regional trade in East Africa. I have a number of points. Some of them have been actually touched by some predecessors taking the floor. It's actually the need to deepen a bit the analysis in terms of intra-regional trade, using the very data we have to identify major players in terms of export and imports, so that at least we know if there is any policy to target these, we know them very well and can identify the value chains which are actually driving the intra-regional trade, both in terms of export and import, which is really interesting. A second one, I wanted to hear a bit about the trade between East Africa and Central Africa. We had produced a report in our sub-region sometime using the demand-supply model for our countries for some value chains to try and locate where the markets and for which products are lying for our countries, and could see that there are opportunities and value chains where the two sub-regions are trading very much, and where we think we can again strengthen ties between the two sub-regions. Maybe why not sometime a box or a very short policy paper based on the good analysis you have, some Simon and the others, and trade data we can have it, and see how we can strengthen intra-regional trade between our two sub-regions. I like the intervention of linking these trade trends and trade policy issues with industrial ones, special economic zones in many countries in East Africa are playing a greater role in terms of supplying some of the countries. How can we help them strengthen the productivity issue someone was talking about, so that they can respond in terms of in a competitive way in supplying our countries, not only in East Africa, but also in Central Africa. I can see the DRC with its huge muscles actually importing a lot. How can we strengthen the industrial structure to respond on this? A colleague from Trademark talked about Trademark about the being really political right by the report. Issues related to social, environmental dimension of our trade would need also to be deepened a bit in the report. So most of the value chains we are using actually may be led by natural resource exploitation. How do we mainstream sustainability into this? All the debates related to traceability of our value chains, Central and East Africa, and how we can make sure that we start again. We emphasize this debate on standards, norms, but sustainability schemes, which would allow us not only to have good market access within our region, which is not very demanding, but tomorrow, how do we make sure that our companies would have good market access at global level? This would be another one. The issue of SMEs, how they participate, major constraints they are having our own SMEs, and how we can support is for me a good one. And finally, the productivity of our infrastructure, our ports, which are playing a very critical role in terms of supplying our countries, roads, corridors, East Africa corridors. I know sometimes we compare them with some of the last ones in Central Africa, but we need actually to put the competitiveness ceiling in comparing them with Southern Africa ones, and so that we can know what the level of Mombasa and the others in terms of productivity and our corridors in East Africa. And the question we are not touching on is all these bans and the political economy of trade, bans in Burundi, bans in I don't know where. How do we address the political challenges and political economy and how it's affecting trade? All the debate in the Great Lakes in relationship with other countries. I think while being politically correct, we need to find a way for addressing this. But anyway, very good report, very good debate, and I hope we can have a way of having such discussion beyond the ice between our two offices, presenting exactly a similar problem and seeing how we can bridge our two sub-regions. But anyway, congratulations, colleagues, and well done. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for those kind words, Jean-Luc. Much appreciated. So you raised quite a number of important issues there. Let me touch on a couple of them. So I totally agree with you. We do need to be speaking with the main players in intra-regional trade, know which companies are the ones that are responsible for the bulk of this trade. And I think that's a conversation we often don't have. We often fixate a little bit too much on the SME side, and we don't look at the players that are responsible for the bulk of the trade. And we do have some companies which span our respective sub-regions with their economic activities, with their foreign direct investment, and they are major drivers of trade. So I think we should talk about that a little bit more frequently. I also wanted to just stress this issue of the trade between Eastern Africa and Central Africa effectively is quite limited at the moment. And that's partly because of infrastructure deficits, but it is also because Central Africa, excuse me for saying this, Jean-Luc, but is probably the sub-region of the whole continent which is least integrated alongside North Africa with the rest of the continent. And I think at some point that becomes a bit of a challenge for the AFCFTA itself, because we know that 80% of African trade is within the existing regional economic communities and only 20% between the regional economic communities. And Central Africa, in a sense, is a bit of a blockage for greater intra-regional trade between East and West on the one hand and South and North. Now, I have seen from the trade figures that Central Africans' imports from the continent have been going up. The export share is still quite low, but you are starting to import more from the continent. And if I recall correctly from the statistics, it seems to be that you're importing more from Southern Africa, but not that much more from Eastern Africa. I think for us to look at the breakdown of some of these figures would be very important, wouldn't it? Because we do need a more integrated Central African economy, I think, if the AFCFTA is going to work going forward. Shall we continue the discussion with bringing in some other colleagues and people are asking for the floor? I see Claire would like to come back on a point.
Yes. So maybe before Claire comes back, there was a question that you had asked about Madagascar and textile industry. So Madame Modeste would like to respond to you. So Madame Modeste, Madame Modeste, vous avez la parole, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup de m'avoir donné la parole et bonjour à tous. Je suis Modeste Joéline, le directeur du commerce extérieur au niveau du ministère de l'Industrialisation et du commerce de Madagascar. Alors, comme Madame le secrétaire général l'a dit, donc je vais intervenir. Si j'ai bien compris la question d'Andrew, c'est
Oui.
par rapport à l'impact de la cessation de l'AGOA pour Madagascar par rapport à celui de 2010 et celui d'actuel. Effectivement, oui, merci. Effectivement, il y a une différence même parce que celui de 2010, on le sait, la raison même sont différents parce que à cause de la crise politique, donc il y avait l'arrêt. Donc, il n'y a pas que celui venant des États-Unis, mais il y avait aussi des facteurs interne du pays. Donc, tout ça aura un impact vraiment plus lourd, si on peut dire ça, au niveau de l'économie et des opérateurs du secteur du textile. Mais actuellement, on le sait que c'est vraiment pas que Madagascar. L'autre, c'était uniquement pour le cas de Madagascar. Mais ici, là, pour le 2025, c'est un arrêt de l'AGOA lui-même et qui n'est pas un cas isolé pour Madagascar. Et si je peux dire ça comme ça, donc Madagascar a plus la chance de mieux se trouver une solution appropriée pour aider le secteur à trouver un moyen, si je peux dire, comme Madame le secrétaire général l'a dit, un moyen rapide, comme elle l'a dit tout à l'heure, c'est-à-dire trouver une solution pour résoudre cela, pour que l'impact ne soit pas vraiment avoir un impact très très négatif, si je peux dire ça, par rapport à ce qui s'est passé avant, et voire même projeter des programmes à moyen et à moyen et long terme pour remédier à cela. Donc ça, c'est la grande différence. C'est la réaction même du gouvernement et du secteur privé à voir comment vraiment améliorer la situation et trouver une solution même avant même la cessation de cette AGOA. Et ce que j'ai remarqué, que je remercie beaucoup votre intervention de tout à l'heure avec les présentations, parce que exactement, donc les parties à venir, vraiment, c'est vraiment de tourner vers les autres marchés. Et c'est l'opportunité que Madagascar est vraiment en train de voir, c'est par exemple le cas de la ZLCAF, parce qu'on a récemment ratifié l'accord et c'est vraiment une des moyens pour nous de trouver un moyen d'avancer et de résoudre la situation, même s'il y aura toujours la continuité de la GOA, mais c'est vraiment maintenant comment vraiment ne pas se focaliser uniquement avec les États-Unis, mais de faire une diversification. Et si je peux me permettre vraiment, c'est une chose qui est très importante par rapport à la ZLCAF, si je peux le dire ici, c'est la prise en compte de l'infrastructure, comme Monsieur Jean l'a dit tout à l'heure. Parce que pour Madagascar, par exemple, nous sommes un pays insulaire et ça compte beaucoup pour nous, tout ce qui est infrastructure. Et ça, c'est une chose que j'aimerais même dire que une des choses qu'on devrait tenir compte dans la ZLCAF, c'est cette situation diversifiée de chaque pays pour pouvoir vraiment assurer l'intégration de tous ces pays-là selon leur situation géographique, économique, et donc pour vraiment assurer vraiment le chaîne de valeur entre nous, pays africains. Parce que pour nous, par exemple, le secteur textile, il est très, très amélioré au niveau avec les États-Unis. Mais si on veut vraiment faire l'intégration, il faut voir comment assurer une chaîne de valeur interne. Et ça, c'est quelque chose que moi, j'aimerais apporter un peu au niveau de cette discussion pour vraiment tenir en compte cette partie d'assurer une intégration de notre continent dans les chaînes de valeur des secteurs clés de chaque pays qui sont concernés. Et une chose aussi, c'est ce que j'ai beaucoup aimé aussi, ce que Madame Claire a dit par rapport au cas de dumping pour le secteur textile, parce que comme je l'ai dit, le secteur textile concerne beaucoup pour nous et c'est quelque chose que nous, on aimerait bien avoir davantage d'informations aussi pour voir comment on puisse travailler ensemble pour participer au développement de ce secteur. Et c'est sûr que le secteur numérique est une des secteurs de digitalisation que nous pourrions vraiment viser aussi pour le cas de Madagascar pour vraiment apporter cette transformation et intégration. Voilà un peu mon intervention et merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup pour ces observations et surtout sur la clarification sur les ECLAF et l'accord de AGOA. Je pense qu'on a un collègue Didier we have a Somalian colleague who wished to speak but was rushing to prayers. Yes, our apologies for holding this on a Friday. I don't know if they'd like to intervene quickly.
Yes, Mr. Osman, do you want to unmute yourself and make a comment before you go, or you have you can't make it.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether he's still here.
Okay. So do we have any other I think Claire wished to come back in as well.
Yes, Claire, you have the floor, and then
we
after
have
Claire, we'll have.
Sorry, Didi.
All right, so yeah, let's have Claire, and then we'll have Mr. Okungu as well.
Thank you, Didier. Perhaps just to make a quick comment on John Bosco's submissions and other speakers who've spoken before me. Perhaps one of the observations that we make in the East African region is the fact that the court system, the East African Court of Justice, while it has some sort of jurisdiction, or like it can be able to adjudicate matters, trade matters between, disputes between these particular countries. What has been observed is that it's not very clear. So for instance, in this, the Tanzanian case is a very glaring example of why perhaps the East African community needs to have a very specific court that litigates on matters of trade and investment, a very specific one. And this is a point that has been put across by a lot of lawyers and experts in regional integration, to the extent that a lot of our trade disputes and investment disputes depend on political negotiations. They depend on political goodwill. And that in its sense does not form or does not give sort of like certainty to businesses. Yeah, and a lot of businesses in East Africa trading between each other are small MSMEs, basically micro, small, and medium enterprises. And because these are small businesses, they may not have the capacity to absorb shocks, changes in the economy as much as the big businesses do. And that's why there's been a call for a court system, a very specific one, that does not overlap with the COMESA codes, because there's also an issue with the East African community countries. Some of them are in the COMESA, and when they have disputes, they can go to COMESA, then they can go to ACJ. So it's not very clear. So that's why there's a rallying call for that, so that in case, like Tanzania made such pronouncements, then business people are able to run to the court as fast as possible to get judicial redress. So perhaps that is just something that I would like to highlight. And just to finish up, or to wrap up my point on multilateralism, whilst the WTO is currently very constrained, obviously we know the problems that are happening with the WTO and the US and everything, perhaps it's a rallying call for members of the WTO to actually strengthen the institution. Perhaps it's time for us to sort of like have a reflection on why it is important to have a global body that regulates trade, because in its sort of like, I can't say absence because it's not absent, but in its weakness, a lot of members have taken advantage of this weakness to impose sanctions, to impose tariffs. We don't want to mention names, but we know who they are. Yeah, on a lot of WTO members, distorting global trade. As you can clearly tell, there's so many jobs on the line in East Africa, including Kenya, because of certain impositions by trade tariffs that have been imposed by the Trump administration. So perhaps this is a moment for us to reflect and see that having the WTO, in as much as members like myself have been opposed to some of the agreements by the WTO, and we've always wanted a lot of reforms, it sure is a good body and actually served its purpose to regulate global trade and to sort of create balance amongst developing and least developed and also more developed economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Yes, that would take us into a very long discussion, wouldn't it, actually, about what is the future of the global trading system in the context of a leader, the world's largest economy, which doesn't seem to wish to support the work of the WTO any longer. yeah, suddenly we're finding the value of the WTO, aren't we? Whereas before people were very critical of it. Yes. So we have another colleague based in Nairobi, Danilo, who's a well-known expert on these themes who wishes to intervene.
Yes.
Danilo, what do you think, though? How is the global trading system going to advance post these American tariffs?
I don't have the crystal ball, so I cannot say. You know, the keyword in this period is unpredictability. So, but according to the estimates I've seen, the last one from the World Bank, from the Economic Prospect Report 2025, July 2025, it seems that there is a serious risk that this tariff will increase and retaliatory measures will escalate. So said that, I would like to just to comment quickly on the issue regarding the increase of EAC export to the United States during the first 3 quarters of 2025. Yes, at first glance, it seems surprising, especially data regarding the Democratic Republic of Congo, but also Tanzania, which is another big exporter of minerals and metals. But in my opinion, there are some factors that have not been mentioned that can also help to have a clearer picture. So the first one is that goods such as steel, aluminium, mineral products like cobalt and so on are excluded from the tariff increases introduced by the US. As you are aware, there's an annex, which is the Annex 2 to the executive order of the President of the United States of the April 2025 that excludes basically 4 categories of products, not all, but most of tariff lines. These are minerals, metals, chemical products, and wood and timber products. So many of EAC export to the United States are concentrated in these categories of products. So they have been relatively low affected by tariff increases because they, being excluded, they continued to benefit from the preferential tariff rates under the AGOA until it expired 3 days ago. So another point that is important to raise is that tariffs on other regions, as it was shown in your first presentation, in your first slides, have made African exports relatively more competitively compared to other regions. Like, for instance, Latin America, I've seen a 50% increase in tariff rates for Brazil. Southeast Asia, tariff rates going from 30% to 50% on average. So, as a consequence, Africa, again, that on average has been hit with a lower tariff compared to this region, has gained, let's say, a small competitive advantage compared to these regions. Also, lower commodity prices combined with the depreciation of US dollars have made African commodities export cheaper, so more attractive for US buyers. And fourth and last point, the one that you mentioned, Andrew, regarding the behavior of some American firms, especially the practice of stockpiling that has been increased to shield many business from this increase in the cost of some products. And again, metals and minerals are among the commodities that are more subject to this stockpile behavior because they are durable goods, they are not perishable. So 2 quick comments regarding the presentation of Rogers. I was surprised to see that Djibouti increased significantly export to the United States. Now, I know Djibouti quite well. I've traveled there many times. And I know that the country let's say, doesn't produce almost anything. They have basically three categories of products that are exported. Salt, which is also exported internationally, fish and seafood, which is mostly, let's say, almost totally exported regionally, and livestock, also mostly exported regionally or to the Middle East countries like Yemen and other countries in that region. So I was surprised to see this increase in export volume to the United States, except in that data you don't include the re-export, because I cannot even explain the special economic zones. You know, Djibouti has many big special economic zones, but these zones, on average, they carry out very minimal processing activities, so mainly packaging, labeling. So these operations, they don't determine any change in the origin of the goods that are exported. So I cannot explain this reported growth in export, except if you included the re-export, or because you include, for instance, a re-export from Ethiopia, because Djibouti is the main hub to exporting to Ethiopia. Another comment regarding the presentation of Simone. I've seen Simone showed the declining prices in growing export volumes of coffee, and she specified the Arabica variety, mentioning specifically Uganda. Also, this data was a bit confusing for me, because Uganda, as you are aware, is one of the largest producers of coffee in the world, but not of Arabica, of the Robusta variety. More than 80% of Ugandan coffee is of Robusta. And the quantity of Arabica that is produced is about 15,000 metric tons per year, which is absolutely nothing compared, for instance, to Ethiopia. There has an average during the year from 500,000 to 600,000 or more metric tons.
Danilo?
So I was wondering if it was a correct
Yes.
reference.
Danilo, you have a wealth of material you have provided us with for discussion there. Let me just follow up on a couple of points, and then I'll ask Rogers and Simone to come in as well. So on this particular issue of the coffee, yes, effectively we picked the Arabica one to show. Robusta has also been up the prices, even though the prices have not increased to the same extent as Arabica. So if you see, for example, the declaration of the Minister of Finance, Kasaija, for the budget this year, he reports the coffee exports have been very, very good. $1.8 billion in the financial year 24-25, and they're forecasting more than $2 billion for the first time this coming year. So it's clear that their coffee exports have been strong, and it's been buoyed up by a combination of higher volumes, but particularly higher prices. But you're quite right to point out that particular indicator doesn't refer so much to Uganda's coffee exports. So you raised the question on Djibouti. We actually, I don't know if we have a Madam Kadra on the line. We raised this question about why did the Djiboutian exports go up to the US, and apparently she explained that it's related more to the American base, those activities of imports and exports, than to the domestic economy of Djibouti. And the value, I think, was from 10 million to 27 million. So, yeah, my understanding, I don't know if Madam Kadra from the Ministry of Finance is online now. She may wish to explain that herself. Rogers, Simone, do you have something you would like to come back to Danilo on?
Peut-être pour M. Danilo, c'est pour dire qu'il a totalement raison. Mais ce que nous voulions montrer dans les différentes flambées des prix, c'était justement de prendre les prix les plus significatifs. Et pour ce cas, c'était le café Arabica que nous avons matérialisé. Maintenant, nous n'avons pas lié la croissance des exportations de l'Ouganda au fait des exportations du café Arabica, parce qu'on a aussi mentionné le prix de l'or qui a tellement augmenté. Et c'est ces éléments combinés qui ont boosté les exportations de l'Ouganda, pas spécifiquement uniquement sur le prix du café Arabica, non. C'est juste la précision que je voudrais faire. Merci.
Rogers, as our resident Ugandan colleague.
No, I just want to point out to Danilo that actually the boom in coffee exports from Uganda is largely driven by Robusta coffee. You're right, Arabica is just grown in one part of the country, so you're right about that. But the boom, like my colleagues have pointed out, well, you had a price increase in both Arabica and Robusta. Now, just Andy had discussed the Djibouti question. That's what I had wanted to talk about. But just to point out that this data actually is data from the US. We got this data from the US. So we're just trying to explain the trends in data that we're getting from the US. This is not, we were surprised to see this data, some of the trends in this data, but it's an interesting data set because I think it's the only one that, it's one of it provides the latest numbers of exports to the US.
Or rather imports from reported by the US, yes,
Yeah.
on a monthly basis. So you can monitor quite closely what's being received on the US side. And as we said,
if I
yes.
can reply
Yeah.
very quickly, there is something wrong in the way statistic data are collected in that area, in the Horn of Africa, because I've seen also the latest area report, to which I also contributed, indicates IGAD one of the RECs with the highest level of intra-regional trade, which is, in my opinion, not correct, because I personally developed a model for calculating for the Horn of Africa initiative the intra-African, intra-IGAD trade flow. Actually, all the countries, less Uganda, because the Horn of Africa initiative covers 7 out of the 8 IGAD countries. And the average intra-regional level I calculated was between 6 and 12, according to the intra-regional import or export. So I don't explain these figures that I've seen also in other reports, including some recent report from Tralac. Thank you.
So Danilo, I mean, I think you put your finger on the point. You know, it's tied up with the re-exports and the treatment of re-exports, which is misrepresented sometimes, isn't it? Now, countries like Kenya do report domestic exports and re-exports separately, actually. They're quite meticulous on that. I think in some of these cases like Djibouti, what's being considered as exports are actually just re-exports coming from the port of Djibouti and out. So that does give a misleading impression, effectively. That's a task, isn't it, where us as trade economists need to help assist, in terms of understanding better what the underlying trends are and avoiding the misrepresentation of the data sometimes. Yeah, you're quite right. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Didier, we have a couple of other people online that would like to speak. I think Philip Okungu would like to intervene.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mold.
Yes.
It's my pleasure to be here representing ARSO, the African Organization for Standardization, a body that was formed by the African Union and UNECA way back 1977. And our key role...
Is it that long-standing? I didn't know its history went back to 1977. My goodness.
Oh, yes. We are here since 1977.
Yep.
And our role has been promoting common regulatory framework in Africa. Thank you very much. And regards from our Secretary General, Dr. Hermogen Sengemana.
Thank you.
It's a great opportunity to discuss the issues of industrialization, trade in Africa, and also mostly regarding the East African bloc. I want to agree more about the key challenge which Africa as a region has been going through for a long time in its industrialization and integration agenda. This one has been on how to move off an economic growth path built on commodity exports to a more sustainable development path and industrialization based on the production of high quality export-oriented products, and at the same time enhancing intra-African trade, while at the same time addressing the issues of technical barriers to trade. And I'm glad that most of the presentations have highlighted these issues, starting from the East African community. If you look at the African integration agenda, we are informed that it has gone through about 3 phases now, which have been recorded. 1980 to 1991 or 92, we had the first industrial development decade for Africa recorded under the Lagos Plan of Action Blueprint. And in this case, focusing on export-oriented development or industrialization and integration, the SMEs, the priority sectors, the textile and leather, the agriculture, and the issues of adding value. Then the second industrial development decade for Africa based on the Abuja Treaty of 1991, lasting 1993 to around 2003, and mostly also still talking about increasing the African productivity, export-oriented, and also concentrating in inter-African trade. And finally, although we had a lapse, but this one was based because this African situation has been attracting the attention of not only the African leaders and experts, economic and trade experts like yourself, but also the United Nations. And you realize that the United Nations, through their General Assembly in 2016, through their resolution ARES 7293, declared 2016-2026 the third industrial development decade for Africa. And in this case, now we were in the section of Agenda 2063 and the FCFTA. And the issues that were being addressed were now to help in the implementation of Agenda 2063 and the FCFTA. UNIDO, given the opportunity to develop the implementation matrix, highlighted the issues of priority sectors, regional value chains for Africa, the intra-African trade, the made-in-Africa products, and mostly the quality infrastructure and common regulatory framework. And talking about the common regulatory framework, what these industrialization decades have highlighted all along is that industrialization and trade are two sides of the same coin. What is good for industrialization is good for trade. And the glue that sticks them together is standardization or effective quality infrastructure. The industrialization, in this case, we are the industries, the industrial development, the manufacturing, the export-oriented products that we want to develop. It is the standards which come in and list down the specifications of these products, the quality based on the market requirements, so that we ensure that from the industries we have goods that are export-oriented and ready. But at the same time, you go to trade, you go to the market and market assess, you get the issues of certification. The issues of certification now wants to ensure that the products that you have brought and you are trading on meets the standards, the technical regulations. So you realize that if you can say my product meets standards, but at the market access level, the market entry, the standards come in again in terms of certification systems, accreditations to ensure that really your products really meet, and then they are allowed or rejected back. So the industrialization and trade, two sides of the same coin, glued together by standardization. And when we realize that what has been the problem of Africa has been the issue of weak production, the issues of tariffs, cost, and the issues of non-tariff barriers to trade, where now technical measures like sanitary and phytosanitary, the issues that deal with plant health, human health, the issues of technical barriers to trade standards, technical regulations, conformity assessments, now come in, and this is where now we are, and we say we really need now to focus on ourselves and intra-African trade. We talked about, and I'm very happy about how experts have been talking about non-tariff barriers to trade, the issues of standards coming in. And we realize that where we are and where we have reached, we have been here since 1947, when the General Agreement for Trade and Tariffs was signed. And then the development and the establishment of the WTO, globalization and trade liberalizations come in. WTO gives all countries the opportunity to develop technical regulation standards, conformity assessment, rules that give them legitimate objectives to protect health, security, and environment. And you realize that for Africa, since we have got so many regional economic communities, we have ended up with a patchwork of different regulations, which also affect us in East Africa. So the harmonization level comes in, and that's where now the work of ASO now comes very important, the application of harmonized rules. I like one colleague here who had expressed the fears of WTO now becoming weak, and WTO has been the one regulating international trade through its TBT and SPS agreements, which gives everybody, all nations, opportunity to develop regulations and standards that protect their consumers and protect their environment, but at the same time saying that it should be based on harmonized and international standards or harmonized regulatory framework. But if now WTO is not now really up to the game, then now you see where we are, because countries are now taking advantage because it is their rights and their rights given by the WTO TBT to develop these regulations. But at the same time, they should not really protect their environment or protect their markets, as now in the case. So now that one takes us to now our third industrial revolution or development in Africa, the FCFTA and Agenda 2063, which has come now to make Africa now reach its final stage industrialization. And I saw some question, how can we now use the FCFTA to improve intra-African trade, improve the quality infrastructure? And I think when it comes to the FCFTA agreement, there are clauses and there are annexes which now gives us the opportunity. If you see the tariffs, the issues of tariff concessions, the countries which have already ratified the agreement should give at least 90% of tariff concession. And that one is a rule now given. Then the issues of rules of origin, which now affects our regional value chains and made in Africa platforms, are addressed under Annex 2, and it takes care of all the regional economic communities, different rules of origins and how to apply. And the issues of non-tariff barriers to trade, the standards, the technical regulation, the conformity assessment are addressed under TBT Annex 6 and Annex 7, where the role of ASO now comes in. And also the issue of NTBs, where we are realizing that there are a lot of challenges coming in. The issue of how do we address the disputes that are coming in? And that one has been elaborated so well under Annex 5, and REX given the opportunity to address them also from the national point of view. So now, when I'm finalizing, I just wanted to highlight that the issues of common regulatory framework based on ASO work and Pan-African quality infrastructure. And UNECA has been a dominant partner here. African Union has been a dominant partner here. We have developed the African quality policy. We have developed the African continental technical regulatory framework, and we have developed the Made in Africa qualification criteria that gives us the opportunity to address all these challenges. And now when I say, what can we do now to address the SMEs, because the SMEs are the engines of development, because they are the ones who are suffering these weak productive systems, then how do we also reach out to our governments? We have in East Africa, the governments, do we really understand, do they really understand the importance of quality infrastructure? Because basically it is the role of a national government to develop a national quality infrastructure, at least a National Bureau of Standards, and at least a National Metrology Institute, so that when you go to the petrol station, you get what you pay for. When you go to the labs, you go to testing, you get the accurate results. And then the accreditation systems that give us, that say, this is Philip and remains Philip. You say, truly this is Philip, and what the certificate is holding are true. So it is the role of the government, but you realize that that one has been a problem in Africa and including East Africa. So I just wanted to finalize on that, and also thank you very much for what is going on. I would have really loved to see a presentation on East Africa and how it is handling the regulatory, the national patchworks of regulations that are in different countries, the common regulatory framework that it has put together. I know the East Africa has developed since 2006 the Standardization Act, which was being revised in 2024, and wanted to see if they have come up also with the issues of mutual recognition arrangements, the use of equivalent standards and all that. So it was a great opportunity. I've been here since Monday, and I'll be here till we finalize. Same time, I wish to pass my regards of our ASO Secretary General, Dr. Nsengemana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. Actually, you've done us a big favor because you've summarized a lot of the discussion, and I don't think we have any need for some closing remarks in that sense. You're preaching to the converted, at least as far as our office is concerned, with regards to the centrality of this issue of standardization and harmonization. If we want a continental market to work, we do need a standardized approach to this, don't we? A common approach. I often say to people, it is the more boring side of integration. Certification and standardization and harmonization, I don't think sets the passions alight for a lot of people, but it is really what this whole process of the AFCFTA and creating a continental market is about. So, you know, we need strong trade facilitation organizations like Trademark East Africa, but we centrally need also ASO support, I think, in this process of harmonization. I think from what Claire was saying as well, it was very important about the litigation within the East Africa community if a member state does not respect the spirit of the agreements they've signed up to. And I used to think regional integration was about the economics, and I've slowly changed my mind, and I feel that the lawyers and the legal aspects and the technical ones are far more important than the actual economic dimension to it. You know, that's at the heart of creating a continental market. So thank you very much for those words. I do see Madam Kadra has been online. Madam Kadra is from the Ministry of Finance in Djibouti. Would you like to just come in very, very quickly, Madam Kadra? No? Changed her mind? Is she unable to speak, Didier?
Allô, oui, bonjour, vous m'entendez?
Bonjour, oui, bonjour, Madame Kadra, bienvenue.
Comme c'est le week-end chez nous, là, la connexion n'est pas stable chez moi.
Bien sûr, oui, désolé. Oui, merci pour
merci beaucoup.
nous rejoindre.
Je tiens à remercier les intervenants, Monsieur Roger, Andrew et Simone, pour les présentations concernant les échanges commerciaux. J'aurais bien aimé que un des ministères du Commerce soit présent de Djibouti pour donner plus de détails. Mais moi, ce que je vais intervenir par rapport aux exportations, j'ai vu les exportations que M. Roger avait présenté, les exportations de Djibouti vers les États-Unis. J'ai déjà peut-être soulevé cette remarque une fois. Elle concerne principalement, comme vous le savez, Djibouti n'est pas un pays exportateur. On est des importateurs. Mais les exportations, ce sont principalement les effets militaires liés à la base stationnée à Djibouti. Ce sont leurs équipements, leurs véhicules, tous les matériels qu'ils exportent vers leurs pays respectifs. Mais pour ce qui est des importations, on peut dire si les nouvelles mesures tarifaires américaines pourraient avoir un impact indirect sur Djibouti. En effet, si elle entraîne une hausse des prix, des perturbations des chaînes de valeur, des chaînes d'approvisionnement mondial, Djibouti, en tant qu'un pays importateur net des des biens, pourrait subir une inflation importée et une augmentation des coûts logistiques. Voilà ce que je peux contribuer par rapport à la présentation de cette journée. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Didier, on voit que Madagascar veut prendre la parole de nouveau.
Madame, vous avez 2 minutes afin que nous puissions clore notre discussion. Oui, Madame Adriana Rina, vous avez la parole vraiment 2-3 minutes maximum. Allez-y. Allez-y.
Oui, je vous remercie pour la parole donnée. Merci aussi pour les présentations. Donc, j'étais vraiment très impressionné par la qualité. Et là où je voudrais juste en fait faire mon intervention, c'est par rapport à l'expérience de Madagascar par rapport à l'AGOA. Le volume des exportations que Madagascar a fait en termes d'habillement vers les États-Unis démontre clairement la capacité de production justement de non seulement pas de Madagascar, mais aussi des pays qui ont bénéficié de l'AGOA. Là où je veux en venir, c'est que nous, pays de l'économie de l'Est africaine, nous avons cette capacité de production-là, mais seulement quand les marchés sont incertains. Donc, voilà les conséquences que nous avons tous. Maintenant, nous avons notre communauté régionale qui est déjà donc en place, la ZLECAf, la SADC, le COMESA et tout ça. Moi, ce que je veux dire, c'est tout simplement, c'est que dans l'agenda 2063 et surtout dans la mise en place et la mise en œuvre des accords comme la ZLECAf, c'est de vraiment orienter l'accès au marché sur cet commerce intra-africain, car nos échanges envers les autres pays, envers les autres grands marchés démontrent clairement la capacité africaine à cette production et surtout justifie de cette nécessité d'industrialisation et d'échange intra-africain. Donc voilà ma petite intervention. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur Adriana Rina, merci beaucoup. Bon, j'aimerais que nous puissions peut-être clore notre conversation. Oh, let me switch it back to English. So as we close this session, so I would like to express my sincere thanks also to the government of representatives, private sector officials, trade economists. I've seen also a few members of the media that joined these conversations. So we do apologize for going slightly beyond the scheduled time, but your engagement and the richness of the discussions really made it worthwhile. So without further ado, let me ask Andrew to give us concluding remarks. Thanks.
Well, I think as I was saying, I think Philip, our colleague from ARSO, did a wonderful summing up of some of the points. Just like to thank everybody for being involved and participating in this event. We will continue to have dialogues around these themes, about the areas that our office particularly specializes in, which is trade and regional integration on the one hand, blue economy and tourism. Thank you very much. And we hope to engage with you all again in the near future. And thank you to all my colleagues for presenting and the other colleagues who have supported the activities of this week. So, and thank you to you, Didier, for helping moderate. And have a good weekend. Bon week-end à tout le monde. Merci, Madame Kadra. Merci, chers collègues de Madagascar. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Merci beaucoup. Bye. Merci beaucoup. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Okongo.
Bye and welcome. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.